Thank you, Astrid, for introducing. And so it happened, and now it begins. Kamara and Stafford. This is an exciting, really exciting day for me. This is a great day, and it's unique. It's unique and special for Goldsmiths. We are blessed and we are honored to welcome you as the two new guest professors in forensic architecture. And welcome. You've taught me, you've taught my colleagues in forensic architecture, I think more than what we've learned in many courses during our academic, so-called academic career. You changed my way of working and thinking, and now hopefully you will change also this place, and God knows that this place, Goldsmiths, needs the change. And hopefully, with your help, we can make it. Your invitation comes from the Center for Research Architecture, from Forensic Architecture. There's so much architecture there, I think you might be justifiably calling yourself architects now, if you like, not only guest professors. And I speak here on behalf of those interlinked centers, Center for Research Architecture and Forensic Architecture. And in the tradition of thinking together that we've evolved at the Center for Research Architecture and in Forensic Architecture, this intro that I'm delivering is actually being more or less collectively written by members of our team as a way of honoring and welcoming you. I say it was collectively written, but it mainly came from under the keyboard of Elizabeth Lizzie Brainer, who sits right over there. We in forensic architecture got to know Stafford and Kamara through working on one of the most difficult events in the history of London, the police killing, or let's say it in a way we know now, after having researched it, the way we feel it, the police murder of Mark Duggan in the afternoon of August 4th, 2011. The most momentous few seconds in the history of this city. Those 2 seconds from the moment that Mark Duggan leaves the minicab where he's traveling on and where he's being subjected to an aggressive hard stop by the police until he's shot for the second time, 2 seconds pass. And what happened during those 2 seconds is still not universally agreed upon. Whether you know that Mark Duggan was murdered during that time, or whether you think that a police officer hidden under the cipher V53 was justifiable in shooting him, depends on who you are within that system. But we've researched that work very closely when forensic architecture was commissioned by the Duggan family through their solicitor, particularly a common friend of us, Raju Bhatt from Bhatt Murphy, asking us to reconstruct that crime, to build a model that reconstruct those 2 seconds for a civil case, the last available opportunity for the family to ask for public accountability of what happened to Mark Duggan and what happened to them and what happened to the community since that murder has taken place. We're preparing for the civil case. We prepared all our work, and just like in many civil cases in the UK, the trial was avoided by a pre-trial settlement. The settlement was generous with the family. It was accepted by the family. We support the family in having accepted it, but it left also a sense of deep disappointment because people wanted a trial. We wanted justice to be made publicly. We wanted people to see what we knew has taken place during those 2 seconds. Mark Duggan left the car without a gun in his hand, was shot by a police officer that could see very clearly he did not have a gun in his hand. But the civil case was settled, and there was no trial. There was no demonstrable accountability. Raju Bhatt, who represented the Duggan family, had an idea, strange idea, but an idea that started us on our common journey. He introduced us to Stafford Scott, and he brought Stafford to Goldsmiths to meet with us and to think about what it is that we could do together. Now remember, we were sitting at the Center for Research Architecture around a round table, and Stafford said, the first thing we need to do is to take the investigation, what we know to be true, and present it before anyone else to the community, the affected community in Tottenham. And so he organized a magnificent town hall event in Tottenham where the investigation was presented to the family of Mark Duggan and to the rest of the community. Then things started to take a kind of like a strange path, as they do sometimes with forensic architecture. We were invited to present yet another exhibition at the ICA, the Institute of Contemporary Arts. We had a major exhibition there in 2018. And we decided actually it was a much, much better idea to pass on the invitation. Stafford joined with Kamara Scott and a prolific writer, curator and researcher, Rihanna Jade Parker, to conceive the exhibition War in a Babylon, the community's struggle for truth and rights. It was a great collaboration, mainly thanks to Kamara Scott, who is a creative genius behind it. Kamara is a creative producer and a journalist with experience at The Guardian. And with her and Rihanna, they gave shape to that exhibition. So that exhibition actually had a presentation of those 2 seconds in which Mark Duggan was murdered. But around it was the entire story of black resistance to British policing. So a moment in time, a split second, and around it, the big and framing history. Kamara studied politics and social policy at Brighton University. She has since worked at the monitoring group, following which she became a criminal defense paralegal with interest in community responses to policing, action against the police, and institutional racism across the legal system. What became most useful for this project is she, at the very same time, embarked upon a multiple creative project, producing film with various agencies, all films centering black storytelling of culture and community. So working on that exhibition was a learning process. The most profound, as I said, the most profound learning process that we in forensic architecture have undergone. And finally, I think after about hundreds of so exhibitions that we've done, we learned how to make an exhibition, how to locate an investigative process within the sort of the wider cultural, historical, political context around it, how to locate an exhibition. And we were incredibly moved and honored to have that universe opened around those 2 seconds that were presented within that exhibition. We understand what exhibitions could do. We understood that what was denied in the court, a public presentation of justice and accountability, became possible in an exhibition. That the exhibition became something like a public cultural tribunal that could deal with the situation in a much more profound way than any legal system could. Legal systems tend to reduce the questions to the technicalities, to the moment. But the advantage of this sort of like public trial, if you like, that happened at the ICA was that it was presented within the cultural and historical context. In its roundup of the top exhibitions around the world, Hyperallergic distinguished War in a Babylon as a once-in-a-generation show. and the best exhibition of 2021. Best exhibition worldwide. I mean, this is something that is absolutely phenomenal as a reception. It had record visit numbers, particularly during the bi-weekly, several hours long guided tours that Stafford, mainly, but also Kamara, made throughout the show's duration. If you want to wonder what is a guided tour in an exhibition and how electrifying it could be, you should have seen those events. I mean, they are recorded, there are videos of them. We will share those videos. They sometimes extended to what was the record? 4 hours long guided tour throughout that. That was like an absolutely incredible live performance of great knowledge and ideas. All the public programs were consistently sold out. There were school groups that traveled to see the show from around the United Kingdom. The program was, of course, nothing like what an art space has seen and may ever see again. It brought in a range of artist activists and representatives, from Justice for Grenfell, from Inquest, from the United Families and Friends campaign, from the Monitoring Group, and from the Broadwater Farm Youth Association. The show opened in 2021, just a few months after the publication of the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities report, a government dossier, the findings of which, the findings in quotation mark, deny the ongoing existence of institutional racism in the UK. With the Windrush scandal still fresh, War in the Babylon felt in many ways like a response that this report deserved. This was the reason that the magazine Okula called the exhibition not only the race report the UK needs right now, but a call for action. An exhibition that is a call for action. An exhibition that is an action in the world. It's not an act of representation. It was an action. The exhibition frames both Scott's lifelong endeavor to distinguish the concept of justice, which they regard as having been corrupted by racially biased judicial system. There is no justice, they repeated at the exhibition launch event, inviting the crowd composed largely of black Londoners and family members of individuals affected by police violence to join them in concluding, there is just us. But because of Bo Scott's effort, those who fall under the designation of us is ever growing. Thank you, Lizzie, for this. Now about Stafford. I spoke about Kamara. Let's speak about Stafford. An activist in the truest sense of the word, a force of unparalleled intellect, empathy, and political rigor, Stafford has been at the forefront of the fight for black British rights since the 1980s. His leadership with Black Justice Campaign has yielded overturned convictions, new legal reviews, and more importantly, transforming the political discourse around police violence and anti-racist histories in the UK. Since playing a critical role in the Broadwater Farm defense campaign in the 1980s, Stafford has gone on to bring community concerns into forum as varied as the House of Commons, town halls, major media outlets, and London's foremost spaces of contemporary art, recognizing the value of mobilizing across different forums. And in that, this is also a lesson that we learned from your work, that in order to mobilize political action, you need to operate across different forums. And no one forum is going to answer everything that a campaign needs. In 1985, Stafford rose to prominence as the co-founder of the Broadwater Farm Defense Campaign, which played a critical role in endangering the release of the Tottenham Three men who had been wrongfully convicted of the murder of a police officer during the Broadwater Farm uprising and sentenced to life in prison, despite a distinct lack of evidence. So evidence also play a role, and the political dimension of that evidence and what it could mobilize when you acquire it. The Broadwater Farm Defense Campaign went on to evolve into the activist group Tottenham Right, still under Scott's leadership, within which he led countless initiatives in support of victims of police violence in the North London borough and beyond. Through it, Scott demanded accountability for the tragic death of Cynthia Jarrett, Joy Gardner, Roger Sylvester and Mark Duggan at the hand of his yet uncondemned member of the police. In fact, he was one of the first to arrive outside the Tottenham police station following Mark Duggan's killing to call for the release of information, of evidence. And I dare speculate that he will be amongst the last to continue relentlessly demanding justice for Mark Duggan and fellow victims of police violence. Scott was formerly a race advocacy officer for the monitoring group, with whom he continues to collaborate. He has written for The Guardian, and notably, it was him that exposed the Met Police gang matrix, a digital process of criminalization through which black and minority ethnic people were unfairly identified by the police as gang members. Digitally, supposed digital process that produced criminalization. Widely used tactic. This is a widely used tactic for securing more convictions. So they are they are forces to reckon with. Both Stafford and Kamara Scott are both tireless, and they are, like us, tired. Tired to fight the same battles again and again. And as the recent police killing of Chris Kaba demonstrates. Let's hear from them now. Thank you so much for coming. It's a great honor to have you here. And let's begin this series now.
Thank you, Eyal. I feel like you've said everything that I was going to cover in my presentation, but I'll give it a go anyway. Okay. So when we first heard the news about the opportunity for a public exhibition initiated by the work of Forensic Architecture in February 2020, the War in Babylon, as we eventually came to call it, had already been a long-time experience across generations of black communities living and raised in Britain. Growing up with Stafford, I had always been both aware and proud of the work that my dad and the wider community was involved in, but this was a new opportunity to expand the ability to tell the story of our radical black grassroots community using a visual space designed to engage people on a critical level. To be in a gallery meant that the community we represented, often through protests and community meetings in response to tragic events, would have a space where nuanced dialogue and deeper interrogation could be embraced. It was also an opportunity to expand the narrative across multiple generations that hadn't yet been connected through a cohesive and publicly available narrative. For many people, the killing of Mark Duggan was one of the first cases in which people were direct witnesses to police brutality and corruption, and the confluence of policymakers and media platforms' condemnation and targeting of black communities that contributed to wider issues, especially policing itself. Overall, the killing of Mark Duggan re-exposed the many methods and institutional practices of the denial of black human rights in so-called liberal democracies. In 2011, it was reaffirmed that even when we were evidently victims of state abuses that were so regularly discussed by older generations of grassroots black community members, the things that were inhumanely and disproportionately experienced by black communities would not be sufficient enough to call for radical social change. As active community members, we knew that accountability would be a starting solution for the courseless atrocities that we continue to face, but we've received quite the opposite instead. For many young people, it was the first time they were standing shoulder to shoulder with older generations who had experienced these senseless and targeted killings before, and the first time a discourse could come about what long-standing preventative strategies developed at a grassroots level looks like, how it could be sustained, and what we needed to do together to make that change tangible. To be given the full scope of a building and the full trust of forensic architecture, to provide a visual and interactive narrative that could stand alongside their own integral work and represent such a wide range of experiences was a blessing. Being alongside FA's critical piece of work, which highlighted to us the benefit of working with external partners and the ability to utilize academic, technological and alternative investigatory practices whilst centering notions of how truth is revealed or dictated and what is understood as evidence, this space offered us an opportunity to reveal and expand upon decades worth of community experiences around incredibly sensitive topics which otherwise are only spoken about or engaged with in the urgent and emotive aftermath of a tragic event. The nature of challenging injustices is that, unfortunately, it is often a short-lived and reactive reflection of anger and trauma and is difficult to sustain beyond. Whilst we as Tottenhamites knew of the long-standing histories, we would also have to encourage people to learn about the methodical practices of activism alongside providing a historic education so that a new blueprint for what challenging state oppression and racial tensions meant. For our first visit at the ICA, my father and his best friend, sorry, that was the last picture, were astonished by the amount of space that we had been given, but more so in itself, the connection that it had to the state that they had both been in direct conflict with for the majority of their life. The irony of the space at the time is that the exhibition it had on reflected its white wall nature. It was specifically about the ICA's colonial legacy and its connections to slavery in the past. In order to envision a new energy, purpose, and identity for this space, the curatorial team, including myself, Rihanna Jade Parker, and our graphic designer, Abby Wright, spent 6 months within the ICA researching, collating, and mapping out the histories, lived testimonies, archival material, and more to piece together the missing narratives of a Black British history that could inform and engage a new audience in critical, urgent, and fundamentally life-changing ways. We had to address the fundamental issues of state that include suppression of access to justice, the fact of misleading information that arises as a response to police brutality in the media, government misactions, and the dissenting events that occur as a response, and very often cause chaos in the present moment. We had to ensure the voices we represented were humanized, reflecting the variety of experiences faced by the Black community over the course of 7 decades. And we had to address the changes in state that occurred or didn't occur as a response to tragedies faced by the Black community. We had to highlight the agitation and disruption that was a fundamental characteristic of the Black British struggle, but also was consequential for the state as the Black community relentlessly defended itself. There is often a misunderstanding that nothing has been done or no change has come about in this country. And whilst there remains much to do and a relentless attack on Black people globally, that has fundamentally changed. And this is not something that we could allow people to attend and leave thinking we had a We had a responsibility to change the narrative about what meaningful change is, to highlight the fundamental changes that have been made. For example, how policing has changed as a result of sus being scrapped, changes in stop and search, statistics around deaths in custody, and the introduction of things like interviews for police in custody. Ultimately, we believe that the wider act of state oppression cannot change as it exists to dominate populations. However, on a community level, much has changed and continues to do so only because of the dedicated work of grassroots communities. Our responsibility was to highlight that there was no justice, just us, and that was not only a phrase to inspire, but a fundamental perspective that transformed the struggle from a hopeless one to an empowered one that centered community building, self-realization, and communal empowerment. One of the questions in the initial stages of why we didn't decide to go deeper into the colonial legacies was why we didn't decide to go into the colonial legacies. Ultimately, with a limited amount of space, time and resources to reflect the Black British experience, which long precedes our arrival with the Windrush, we had to make some choices about the pace and felt that we wanted people to experience. Whilst discomfort for most who visited was inevitable, including for those who had lived the stories of War in Babylon prior to it being an exhibition, building a sense of urgency whilst maintaining a timeline that felt directly connected to today's audience was critical. By 2011, when Mark Duggan was killed by the police in Tottenham, he was the fourth person at that time to be killed by the police, again in Tottenham. With Tottenham being a long-standing frontline community since the arrival of West Indians en masse, it had already been established as having a tense history with the police, local government, wider political actors, and was labelled across the media and within public discourse for its notoriety surrounding racial tensions in the UK. With Tottenham at this point had already been the epicenter for some of the most serious uprisings seen in the UK, and as a continuation, it became the epicenter once again for the eruptions that followed Mark Duggan's death. For my father, he has always said that the struggle with the state is not a black issue, it is a fundamentally British one. His experiences in Tottenham and those of the wider community informed us as curators and in the role of everyday people that the continuity between the killing of Mark and those that had been killed before was not as a result of chance, but a particular kind of state response to organized communities who resist the state and protect their own identities. It was a strategic effort to suppress and criminalize those communities and disrupt them on a personal and infrastructural level so that they could not rebel against the daily oppression that they faced. The lead photograph for the exhibition, it was mainly used because it depicted 3 generations of struggle. In particular, it articulated the intergenerational inheritance of struggle and the obvious connection between deaths in different decades as it stood next to the picture of Marcia Rigg in 2011 protesting on behalf of the Mark Duggan campaign. Mark Duggan was a youth from Broadwater Farm where my father spent his youth campaigning against police brutality and deaths in custody. He was a youth who represented a millennial generation who are now living in the aftermath of the UK's widest and best documented public uprisings in a generation. The visible connections that we were able to gauge simply from one family tree was a reminder that the personal narrative was key, central and imminent. The notion that everybody who comes across War in Babylon is related to someone who has been involved in the War in Babylon itself or will be forced to reconcile with it at some point reaffirmed the need for this to be seen as a campaign, a grassroots education, a present-day challenge towards the state and nothing less than what it had been framed as on the front lines. We had to be responsible and ensure that all actors were represented and their separate roles and personalities could be discerned, from the bereaved families of those killed in state custody to those who faced everyday racism, from the campaigners whose experiences were born out of direct experiences of tragedy to the lawyers and supporting legal advocates whose voluntary contributions to the struggle allowed structural discourse to be pushed forward from within the justice system itself. The painstaking efforts of those affected and closest to the struggles had to be depicted, not only for accurate storytelling, but out of sheer reverence and respect for the commitment and struggle, to be used as an example of tireless and integral work as a means of depicting the depth of the struggle and what it truly means to be a part of anti-racist work, whether as an ally of Black people, a person within the community who takes pride in its development and safety, autonomy and defense. For many people outside of the world of campaigning, the first question they ask is how and why these atrocities continue to happen, for which we had evidence. A subsequent question that people often ask themselves is how and why do campaigners sustain themselves, their communities and the struggle when the onslaught from multiple state agencies is so brutal and so tireless. We spent a lot of time collating material that we then had to put together in a digestible way so that people could understand the different layers. I'm now going to pass on to my father so that he can tell the actual story and
Thank you. I've got
I'll take this. Thank you.
Good evening, good evening, good evening. Where will you people come from? Wow. Wow. I mean, I didn't even know where to start. The welcoming that we had from Eyal, I mean, obviously Kamara kept up her end of the bargain. But after that, everything's downhill. Probably with all you people in the universities, you analyze everything to the last degree, to the nth degree, right? And I do a lot of things just based on emotion and such. It's really interesting being in this space though, Stuart Hall building. I got some respect for Stuart Hall for the works he did back in the day. Policing the Crisis, yeah, that I've tried to read that book at least 10 different times. And either it's really dense in the way it's written, or I'm really dense because I couldn't get through it. And I never ever got through it, but the thing was I knew what was in it because people were living that life all around me. I saw it and I understood it. And one day I got invited to Westminster University, because I don't get invited to many universities, to be quite honest to you. I didn't make it myself because of being a victim in the war in the Babylon. I got invited to Westminster University and they were celebrating the 50th anniversary of that book being written. And it was really interesting because they was all slapping themselves on the back and saying about how brilliant it was. And there was me in the audience, and I just had to say, look, hang on a second. Whilst you're all slapping yourself on the back and talking about how brilliant it was, it's such a pity that we didn't know the people were writing about our experiences, because had we known, maybe we may have dealt with some of those experiences differently. And they looked at me and they said to me, and they did happen to be the white side of the team. Stuart was dead. And they looked at me and they said, oh, we thought Darkus Howe was telling you guys what was going on. And it's like, wow, if you're writing a book about policing the crisis and you just think that this one man is going to take responsibility for telling all of us what was going on, then you kind of got it wrong. And what I wanted them to understand was, had they brought that knowledge, that research they did about us to us, it might have helped us. And they didn't. So, yeah, I didn't necessarily give them the props that they probably deserve. And I say this because, you know, education is a great thing. Education is supposed to be the leveler. And my community, we get researched a lot, but we don't get the support and the assistance that always comes out of that research. I went to a book launch. Someone else who was active in our community, he's now a professor. I'm not going to name him because I'm not trying to undermine or disrespect him, because I love him. And when I was at the book launch, I heard him say about another professor that I used to love, but I don't love him no more, so I'm going to say his name. His name's Paul Gilroy, all right? Yeah, I had to get that one in. And I heard him say that Gilroy taught him and said to him, don't write what you want to hear, what you want to say. Write what they want to hear. And I thought, oh, wow. Oh, wow. Then the education can't be the leveler if you can't write the things that you want to say. And I also wondered what the hell they're doing in there if you can't say what you want to say. So I'm glad that I'm in this space today and I'm totally allowed to say the shit that I like to say. All right? And I just had to put that one in as well. I'm glad that we're allowed to say what we want to say, because if we're not allowed to tell our truths, if we're not allowed to tell our story, then nobody's going to know our story, and no one can keep our story alive. And the system, when they want to undermine our story and dilute what we have done, they can deny our story and then tell our kids that we came from nothing, we were nothing, and we've never stood up and we've never resisted. And they can make our kids resist against each other and fight each other rather than fighting the system. So I can't express how happy I am, honored I am, gratitude to that man there, Eyal. He ever since we've met, he's created these opportunities for us that I think that we've managed to repay your confidence, right? But even when I come to these spaces and places, there are people in the spaces and places I leave behind, and they say, "Staff, what are you doing?" I say, "What do you mean? What are you really doing, Staff? We don't even see you no more. Where are you? What? Art? What are you doing in this art place? What are you doing, Staff?" And I tried to say to him, you know what? A man called Bernie Graham once took me to Africa, and he took me in a spot. He took me into the bush in Africa. Right? It was on it was the ANC. Apartheid was still live. He'd taken me to a ANC rally conference in Arusha in Tanzania. I mean, this was amazing. And it was the first time I've been to the motherland, and we was all going off on safari. And at one point, he stopped the bus and he said, "Stop, come here." And he got off the bus and he walked into the bush, and I walked behind him. And he looked around and he looked at me. He said, "Staff, what are you doing?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "You've been smoking that shit." I said, "I don't smoke shit. Shit's cocaine." He said, "You've been smoking the weed." I said, "Of course I have. We're in Africa. This is where it started, right?" He said, "I didn't bring you here for that rubbish." And this is the first time he really had an opportunity to really front me up. He'd taken me away from my power base, which was on Boardwalk Farm. And this is what he said to me: "I didn't bring you here for that. I need you to understand something. You're really powerful, but you're using your power in the wrong way." And I said, "What?" He said, "Yeah, all you do is sit down in the space with the youths and you tell them everything that's wrong with the system. Oh, no. You aggravate and then you annoy and then you wind them up. Do you want to be a part of the problem or a part of the solution?" And then he walked off and went in the minibus. And I took out my spliff and I lit it out. And I thought about what he said. And I realized that there was some truth in what he was saying. And I want to be part of the solution. And the solution can't be that we just sit down in spaces and talk to people who just look like us and are in the same situation as us. The solution has to be that we go out and we try to find like-minded people to share our experiences with. We go out and we find people from all walks of society, so that, as El said, when we say there's no justice, there's just us, it means that there's more than those couple of black kids that are in a room. Because if it's just us, we're going to remain in the position that we've been for a long time. Because as a community, they've found ways to break us down. And as a community, we're not coming together and we're not resisting in the way we did before. So it's an honor to be in these hallowed halls. And I hope that the rest of this presentation doesn't disappoint. So I say to people like Gilroy, who says, "Don't say what you want to say, but say what they want to hear," I say, "Sorry, sir. We're here to talk about a war in Babylon. And we're standing in Babylon whilst we're doing it. Because I think that there's very few universities in this country that isn't linked to the stories that we're going to tell about. I think there's very few universities and institutions in this country that are not rooted and have their roots in the system that we call Babylon." So, right. Can you hear me? Can I do this without holding them up?
Can we take that one
He
instead?
wants me to have two mics. Okay. So bear with me. I'm gonna try and speed through this. This is the first of 4 presentations. We're gonna start at the beginning, but the beginning in terms of the black community or black people in this country, the beginning didn't start with the Windrush, and we're clear about that. The oldest relic known in this country is called Cheddar Pete. Yeah? Okay, Google. All right? Cheddar Pete. And they've recently found out that he had black skin and blue eyes. The oldest relic ever found here. And we all know that humanity started in Africa. We know that, right? Yeah? Come on, you have to ride with me. Because you know when this story started, people weren't accepting or aware that humanity, life, started in Africa. So we've been around for one heck of a long time. But this story is about when the Windrush, oh God, there I go. When the Windrush landed in these shores in 1948. It's a time that they keep on telling us about. It's a time, the first time that Britain faces mass migration from former colonies. So it's a really specific time in the history of this country. So that's when our story starts. And we call this place Babylon. Kamara already told you that's her grandmother. That's my mum, Mrs. Beverly Scott. She was, she became a firebrand. But she came to this country with the intention, as did many from the Windrush generation, that her children will live a better life than the one that she was able to live herself in Jamaica. She came here wanting to be a part of this society and wanting her children to integrate so that we could have the best that was available in this place. She came here full of hope. And she switched because of her experiences in this place. And she became a firebrand. She was the first black female shop steward in the history of Ford's Motor Company. And she called a couple strikes in her time too. We used her in the exhibition as the lead image, but also there came a part in the exhibition, because I didn't tell people at the beginning she was my mum. There was a part in the exhibition when I used her and used that image to explain to people how she tried to integrate us into a society that rejected us, and how the pain of that rejection, well, the pain of the rejection becomes part of the story that we're going to tell today. Right. So we started before we actually started the exhibition, we just wanted to show some of the key players in this war in Babylon, and some of the methods, the methodologies, the tools that they used to wage a war against a defenseless community. And this man here, Kenneth Newman, Commissioner of the Police, 1982. He was brought over, he was Thatcher's general in the war in Babylon. After she had taken on the miners, I think lots we know about that, she took on the miners, she smashed the miners, and in the following election, she said, and now for the inner cities. And that was a euphemism for taking on the black youths who were standing up and rising up in urban areas all over the country. So she sent for this deputy, this general, and he came from the north of Ireland. And he brought with him policing techniques that previously hadn't been needed on these shores. He brought with him, first of all, the technique of outing. And that's what he's doing here when talking about the Jamaicans. In the Jamaican, you have a people who are constitutionally disorderly, simply in their makeup. They're constitutionally disposed to be anti-authority. Bad man them. All right? That was supposed to make people believe the Jamaican people were somehow different and somehow that they required a certain kind of policing that we wouldn't be given to you gentle folk. So if you see our officers treating those Jamaicans, and let's be clear, they didn't know a Jamaican from a Barbadian, from a St. Lucian, or an African in those days. Jamaica, the Jamaican patois was a kind of street currency that we used to engage with each other. And so we could speak in ways that they didn't necessarily understand. So everybody would have sounded like a Jamaican to them. In trying to other the Jamaicans, though, they were telling the rest of the society, we're going to deal with these black people. And don't you worry yourselves. They're going to in special measures because they've earned it. They're getting special measures because they are unique and we're going to deal with them uniquely. And no matter what they tell you, don't believe them because they're predisposed to be anti-authority, as if somehow this was in our DNA. Newman was a really interesting character because, as I said, Thatcher sent for him to come over from the north of Ireland, where he used to be the head of the RUC. That's the Royal Ulster Constabulary. And there, oh, wow. I mean, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, they have some kind of history of policing certain communities in the north of Ireland. And the community that they ultimately police, because most of the police officers happen to be Protestants, the community that they police and they oppressed greatly would have been the Catholic community of the north of Ireland. And they'd learned these tricks on how you can oppress a whole entire community, how you can oppress a majority community with minority amount of people using the maximum amount of force. And these were tactics and tricks that they'd previously learned. During the days of chattel slavery and during colonialization in Africa and Asia. These are the tricks that they learned amongst groups like the Mau Mau. Because you can imagine in Kenya, there are going to be a few black people who are saying, yo, how are we letting these white people into our country, taking all our resources and dominating us? Why don't we come together and get rid of them? There would be people in those countries, groups of people, large groups of people, ready to resist and overthrow. So that would be a bit different from what was happening in England, because the last time that I know of anybody to try and overthrow anybody was Guy Fawkes. So they didn't really need the similar kind of police to the ones that they created on the continent, transported to the north of Ireland, and then brought to this country with this man, Sir Kenneth, where he became Sir Kenneth Newman. Right. And if you don't believe me, you can read my brethren, Dr. Adam Elliott Cooper's book, Black Resistance to British Policing, where he really does tell you the history of this policing before it reaches the UK, before it reaches England. So here we go to the exhibition proper, and really we got some photographs here that are going to remind our community about the landing of the Windrush. We don't show the boat, because if we showed the boat, it means that we were buying into the game that the system wants us to play. Because part of this thing about Babylon, if I explain it properly, Babylon, imperialistic, colonialistic, and it's always trying to reinvent itself and tell the world that what it did in times gone by actually wasn't that bad. Actually, what we did was actually bring up the rest of the world to a certain standard. If it wasn't for us, those people would still be savages and uncivilized now. So always trying to rewrite history and rewrite their role in history. So when they start to talk about this boat called the Windrush, we didn't grow up hearing about the Windrush. I was born in this country in 1960, and my parents were definitely people who came here on the boat. But when people wanted to talk to us about the boat my parents came on, it wasn't called the Windrush, it was the banana boat, right? Why don't you lot fuck off back on that banana boat? Why don't you piss off back to where you come from? It was always about the banana boat. You know, it was really ironic because I found out years later, that there was banana boats. And they came before the war. And when the banana boats stopped coming, those same racist dockers that used to hunt down black people, they rioted because the banana boats weren't coming, because bananas were being rationed and only pregnant women were allowed them. But when we came, then all of a sudden the banana boat became the thing that they used to mock us. So we didn't use the photograph of the Windrush. We used the photograph of this young man here. You can see him standing there, fists clenched. When you see the Windrush, they all get off of the boat, and you can see they're all smiling because they actually believe we've been on the water for a long time, and now we're here in the motherland. Thank God, now we're going to go out there and earn some money. For the first time in our lives, we're going to work and get properly paid for the work we do. So we don't show the picture because they were all misled. The work that they thought was going to be there, the jobs that they thought they were going to have, that wasn't a reality. We show these photographs because after a little while, we know that people started to realize that the investment that they had made, you see this young man here, you see the way he's dressed? He wasn't dressed like that the day before he left the Caribbean. Nobody in the Caribbean really dressed like that. It wouldn't make sense to be in a hot country. People in the Caribbean invested in him. He invested in getting this outfit and getting these clothes because he was coming to this country. And the reason why he wanted to look like that was because people had told them that that's how the English looked. So they wanted to dress the same so that they could come and fit in. That's all they ever wanted to do, fit in, do a bit of work, and be able to look after their families. Many of them came with a 5-year plan. This photograph here, this is Waterloo Station. This is them a couple hours after they got off the Windrush. We show this photograph because in this photograph, no one's smiling. I mean, you can see this young woman's face. I wish I could work out who she was and find her and get to hear her story, because you can see her face. Mummy, me want go home. And everybody else there. Now, almost in this exact spot just the other day, Floella Benjamin, I think she's a Tory peer, right? They launched a statue to help us remember the people who came on the Windrush. And again, that's this revisionist rewriting of history, because now they're trying to make it appear that when people came on the Windrush, we were welcome. So it's this rewriting of history that we see all the time, because if we were welcome then, how could we be in the position that we are today, right? It must be our fault. It must be us to blame. But the truth is, this is what they came to. This was the England that they left those islands for. And you know, when they was leaving those islands, they never for one moment believed that they were going to come and be faced with this onslaught of hatred and racism. In 1962, we had the first Commonwealth Immigration Act. So again, what we keep on trying to show people is we've had this discussion in 1999. A man named Macpherson wants to make the world believe that he coined a definition called institutional racism. But he only coined that definition for the white side of our society. We've known about institutional racism ever since. You can't see things like this and not consider and understand institutional racism. The Commonwealth Immigration Act was begun in 1962. The then Home Secretary, Rab Butler, wrote in a memorandum where there was planning for the act that the great merit of the proposed approach to control was that it could be presented as non-discriminatory, whereas in reality, in its restrictive effect is intended to and would, in fact, operate on coloured people almost exclusively. So when people are making laws and legislation and they're saying that in their preparation, this is institutional racism, right? Come on, I do community stuff. You have to act like our community, okay? It's institutional racism, right? Yes. Right? They've changed in the laws when they see black people come into this country. Before, they used to have that thing called the Aliens Act. But now they see black people come, they're changing the law. Oh, We showed a Pathé film in 1955, a black and white Pathé film of people getting off of the Windrush. And in that film, it talked about 15,000 Germans coming in the same year that 10,000 Afro-Caribbeans came here. I almost said West Indians because that's the language that was used then. 15,000 Germans. They'd just finished having a war. This is in 1940s. They'd just finished having a war with the Germans, and Germans were more welcome than the African Caribbeans, the Jamaicans, those who came from the Caribbean, who came from the colonies, who actually fought in this war for this country. Now, again, I'm sure that lots of people think that they've seen these signs before. If you desire a coverlet for your neighbor, vote Labour. Have you seen that before? No and yes, no and yes. Well, it's fake, all right? Because again, this is revisionist. That's not what it said. It said, if you want a nigger for your neighbor, vote Labour. It was written by the British movement, who were on a par with the National Front. And the Tory party adopted that. And then they adapted it to make it palatable. Look, this is acceptable now. Right? And this is what we grew up in. This was in 1964 in Smethwick. Smethwick was a really special town in the Midlands during those days. I think Enoch's constituency wasn't far from there. We know that when Malcolm X came to this country, because so much anti-racist activity was taking place, that he took a trip to Smethwick. And this is one of their tactics. And they used this in the 1964 general election when the Labour Party won, but in Smethwick, the Tories won because they used these kind of underhand tricks. We've all seen this sign, right? No Irish, no blacks, no dogs. Just to put a little positive note on it, Kamara and I once went to, well, we've been loads of times, in 2012, and this is how you can turn around negatives and turn it into positives, right? I hear sometimes some black people think if you take the worst words, you can take them and turn them into positives. I don't believe that. So they use the N-word and thing. But this is how you can take negative and turn it into positive. Kamara and I went to Derry. We were invited there post the killing of Mark. And we went to Derry, and it was like, I just wanted to go because we could go down the bog side. And I remember when I was growing up, the IRA, and we wasn't allowed to hear them on telly. And I loved the bog side because anytime the bog side came on telly, British Army was in trouble. So we went down there. But when we got there, then I thought to myself, oh, Cam, I'm in trouble, because we went on this demonstration and there happened to be 5,000 or more Irish people, which meant that the vast majority, as a matter of fact, everybody was white. The only black people there was Kamara and I was thinking to myself, how do I make a connection with them? How do I do it in a short space of time when I'm on their turf, remembering Bloody Sunday, a terrible event that happened to them? And this is how I did it. We got to the end of the march, I stood there and saw these 5,000 people, and I reminded them of this sign. No Irish, no blacks, no dogs. And when I said it, they all looked at each other like, yeah, we all know that. That was a long time ago. And I said, and things are getting better now, right? And then they all looked at themselves and said, oh my God, where did they get this guy from? He's mad. And I said, what are you talking about? Things are getting better now, aren't they? And they said, he's mad. And I said, come on, the English love their dogs now. And that's how you can take a negative and turn it into a positive. And right there and then, we had community. I've been there for the next 10 years since Ask Kamara. I've never... Oh, my T-shirt comes from there as well. This is one of their designs. We've been there for the next 10 years. I've never had to buy a pint of Guinness. Right? We made the connection. That's how we made community. We took a negative and turned it into positive, and we found in that the things that connect and link us. But these were the times that our parents had landed in. And our parents they were shocked. We're going to tell you some stories. We're going to tell you about resistance. We're going to tell you about our music and how our music told us, get up, stand up and fight. war until the philosophy that holds one man superior to another, one race superior to another is permanently and finally abolished. There'll always be war. We'll play you some ragamuffin music all day long, and you'll never one day hear anyone in any of the music say, go out there and kill. Go out there and kill white people. Not even kill, go out there and kill racists. As militant as we got, we were never like that. But this is what we were living in, and this is what we were facing. Our parents, because it wasn't their country, our parents just tried to hide and put their heads down and go past it. See it and act as if it wasn't there. This one here, no colour bar here yet. Was there ever a colour bar in England? Was there? We've heard about segregation in America, right? And we've had apartheid in Africa. Was there a colour bar in this country? Yeah, there was. Oh, yeah, there was. It was an unofficial colour bar, but there was definitely a colour bar. That colour bar determined where we lived. No one could come from Jamaica and live in Knightsbridge or Kensington or anywhere like that. We couldn't afford it and they wouldn't allow it. It determined where we lived, and it determined how we lived, and in some instance, it would have determined even if we lived. We're kind of going through chronological order, so the landing of the Windrush is the 40s. We just looked at the 50s and the 60s, and here, as you can see, they're saying Enoch is right. You know who Enoch is, right? Yeah? Yeah, you see? You know who Enoch is. Enoch Powell. And everyone knows him from doing that speech, Rivers of Blood. And he starts off the speech. I like the way he starts off the speech. Within 10 years, the black man is going to have the whip hand. The whip hand, right? So what he's saying to people is, you see, you're letting the people that we used to subjugate, you're letting the people we used to oppress, you're letting the people that we used to whip. You're letting the people that we used to whip come into our country now. Now they're swamping us. Remember, 10,000 came. 10,000 came. Now they're swamping us, and they're going to have the whip hand. So he knew what he was whipping up by using that kind of language, by using that kind of imagery. And what we've never had, and what I'd like hallowed places and spaces like this to do, is do research into the impact. Because in 2021, and we're going to get there eventually, and Eyal referred to it, the Commission for Racial and Ethnic Disparity tried to deny institutional reality even existed in this country. But here we are. He was a senior minister in the government, and although the Tories did, I think, sack him because of what he said, we had to witness, and we saw them, thousands and thousands and thousands coming out and marching in support of Enoch Powell. The dock workers, I mean, they were proper racists, would come out in violent support of Enoch Powell, Britain for the British. Prior to that, it was keep Britain white. I had a mum, you see my mum. My mum wanted us to learn so that we could get out there and compete. So my mum made sure that we could learn how to read before we went to school. Boy, read your book, read. You know, even for birthdays, she would give us exercise books. Write, read, write, read, write. Because we didn't have money for many luxuries, that was what our presents were. So I'd learn to read, and I could read. Mum, when we come out of the house, Mum, what's going on? Don't look, boy, put your head down. So you want me to read, you want me to understand, and when I see crap now, you don't even want to engage with it. Do you understand the kind of dissonance that starts to create in the minds and the heads of young people? They've got this dissonance already because they've come from the lands where people had previously been slaves. They were proud to leave those islands to come here. Some of them, they were leaving those islands for the first time since they'd been brought there as enslaved people. And all of a sudden, you now had to come to this country and act like second class. So this is what we were growing up in. And this is, well, this is just the start of it, to be honest. Because when you have ministers talking about swamping systems and such, you're going to get those who work in the public sector listening. And those who may already have biases and prejudices built within are going to start to work on them because it's being justified, it's being legitimized. And here, this is 1966, so we're going through the motion. 1966, swinging times, right? When the British media, because this is the story the media doesn't tell, when the British media talks about the 60s, they'll tell us it's the swinging 60s, the most liberated decade in British history. 1966 even won the World Cup, well, robbed the World Cup, if you know anything about football, but even won the World Cup. So it should have been a great year, but not if you happen to be black. Don't go out to parties and clubbing around this space in Brixton. This is nigger hunting in the UK. We hear about it happening in America. We hear about lynchings in America, but we don't hear about it here in the UK. Just like we didn't hear about the colour bar. I should have finished on that. The colour bar meant we couldn't live anywhere we wanted to live. It meant when we did get jobs, we were being paid £2 less. Average national wage in factories was £8 a week. Black people got £6 a week. White nurses, £9 a week. Black nurses, £7 a week. You wanted to rent a place, I think our average was 10 shillings, but black people had to pay extra to get rented in slum areas. This was a colour bar. They had to pay extra for everything that we were allowed to do in this place. And when you consider that they were economic migrants that came here with a 5-year plan, that alone messed up that plan. So then they were here to stay, so they tried to have some, to try to build, especially in South London, because that's where people have originally been directed, and we end up in these issues and problems around policing. Nigger hunting. These are police officers who leave the station and they're not coming back unless they have a nigger in tow. And they made the ditty about it at the same time. It's the same little ditty that some people used to sing around me when I was going to school. Sometimes they even used to get me to sing it because I didn't understand what it was. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. When we used to do working out who was going to be it, eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Catch a nigger by the toe. If he hollers, let him go. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. That's the game they were playing in Brixton Police Station. And this is a book written by, a report written by Richard A. Hunt. And he says that it's the sergeants and the constables. He says they're not necessarily directed to do it. It's something that they want to do, that they go out to do. And after they do it, they share jokes about it on the shooting range and in drinking clubs. And this is 1966. In 1965, we had the first Race Discrimination Act, and that actually made inciting racial violence outside of your home. You can incite racial violence inside your home, inside institutions, but outside in public, you wasn't allowed to do it. So even the laws that they were supposed to enforce, they were double breaking by boasting about their nigger hunting exploits. So the colour bar, where we lived, how we lived, what we were paid, had a real impact on us as economic migrants. But even worse, in these days, it's like a replay of what we heard before Brexit. Because we were being blamed for undercutting the workers. Oh, they're undercutting the workers. I just told you, right? The companies would pay £6 a week, whilst they paid white counterparts £8 a week. It wasn't that people went there and said, Massa, please pay me £2 less than my white counterpart. They said, went and asked for a job, and this is what they was given. But the trade unions would say, well, you're undercutting us, so we don't want you here. The trade unions would say, because sometimes I have to remind some of our young people who come to these institutions, right? Don't believe this notion that the left was always our best mates. When they come to incorporate you now because you happen to be here and because they've learned that, when we stand up, we stand up. When they come to incorporate you, don't be fooled. Back in the day, they pointed at us and said, you're undercutting us. We don't want you here. Guess what? We're going to come up with a new policy. Last in, first out. So if there's any economic downturn, it's the darkies that are going. When people said, listen, we want to strike so that we can have equal pay with you, the trade union said, nah, we're not supporting your strikes. But the thing was, these were closed shops in those days. So people were forced to pay their subs to the trade unions. You had no choice. And then the trade unions refused to support the strike. So loads of strikes went on all over the country. Asian community, they are, wow, from Grunwick all over the country. Asian women organizing and striking, and again, the labor movement would not support them. So de facto was supporting the capitalist workers the capitalist bosses against the workers because of their reluctance and their inability to get over the notion of color, their reluctance and inability to get over this whole thing about xenophobia. That very same thing that we saw, oh God, don't let me get into the xenophobia and Brexit, because that's a whole different discussion about what we've just been seeing recently. But what that does is it led our parents to live lives and led us to be born into lives of deprivation. Deprived lives. And then people would look at us and blame us for the condition and state that we were forced to live in. Deprivation. The lack or denial of material benefits considered minimally adequate for survival in a society. To experience deprivation means to lack the basic resources necessary for life. In England, the government tracks deprivation against 7 areas: income, employment, health, disability, education and training, crime, barriers to housing and services, and living environment. Stories that some people like to peddle. So everyone wants us, right now we're supposed to all be going mad because Rishi happens to be a Hindu and he's just made it into parliament, right? Even though but we must ignore the fact that no one actually voted for him to go in there. We should just celebrate that he's there. But stories of individuals overcoming depression are sometimes used to gloss over the ways that government policies create deprived communities, deprived populations. So now we're getting into the 70s and there's an economic downturn. You'll hear about the winter of discontent, right? You've heard about the winter of discontent? Yeah, you're going to get one soon. You're going to be living a winter of discontent soon enough. But we heard about the winter of discontent, and this is during that period where, wow, England's grey. It's hard, it's harsh, the winters are cold, the place is cold. And for people like us now who are being born here, we can't even get the jobs or won't be considered for the jobs that they brought our parents here to do. Now there's no work. It's last in, first out. We're living in slum areas, and it's not that black people came here and made the slums. The slums were here primarily because there'd been a war. Places had been bombed out. They hadn't rebuilt the country. We were forced to live in many of these slum areas. We had a scheme, it was called the partner scheme, because we couldn't get loans from the banks. So some of us would club together. 4 of us would all put, I was going to say £100, but that'd be too much. 4 of us would all put an amount in the pot. 1 of us would take it, use it towards getting a mortgage. And the next month we'd all come back and put money again to help someone to get a mortgage. But they were buying slum dwellings. And eventually local authorities came and forced them to sell. They would buy, compulsory purchase those very homes at a lower rate than those poor people paid for them in the first place, further adding to the impact of deprivation. Employment levels were high and through the roof. Housing Well, we were very restricted in where we could live. My mum used to tell me, thank God for Jewish people, because that's how black people started to live in North London. The link with Stamford Hill enabled lots of people to move into Stoke Newington and then eventually to Tottenham. We went to schools that weren't prepared for us. And again, I'd love someone to do some research. I was in school, I was 8 years old when Enoch Powell said what he said. Now, I can't tell you how, that my teachers suddenly started to act differently towards me at the age of 8, but I know I was called some names by teachers. I once had a teacher bang my head into the desk and call me a little black shit. Bang my head in this. You little black shit. In front of the whole entire class. Corporal punishment was allowed and acceptable. And black kids, again, we were beaten without empathy or sympathy. It wasn't beaten to discipline us. It was beaten based on a hatred and a dislike of how we looked and how we sometimes behaved. As a result of high levels of unemployment, should I go back? As a result of high levels of unemployment, worklessness, homelessness, and also living in homes with parents. Now, our parents were mad. Our parents were mad, right? Those enslaved people, when they were freed, no one gave them counseling. Damn, right? No one gave them counseling. So they'd learned lots of behaviors during that period of enslavement. And it's a long period, 400 years. People have been born into it. So they learned some behaviors that were normalized. And those behaviors were, if you want someone to do something, it's simple. You just brutalize them. No matter how much they resist, you just brutalize them more and more and more. Eventually, you'll break them. Because that's what happened to these enslaved people. And corporal punishment was allowable. So our parents used to batter us in our homes. Batter us for madness, craziness. But we couldn't understand. The other day, my friend came and I was talking to him about it. And he said, Staff, do you remember this one? I said, go on. Who stole the bread? What? Who stole the bread? Not me, mummy. Not me, mummy. Not me, mummy. Everyone's going to say, not me, mummy. Stole the bread, you know, because we're living in a deprived house, right? They got all of them, 5 children. For some reason, it was 5 children, right? You buy a loaf of bread and you got 5 hungry-bellied children. You need to know when the bread's run out before someone else. So they needed to have this stock control. But also, it was about principles and manners. You don't take without asking. If you take without asking, use a thief. So if you took and you didn't answer, and then they said, did you take? You say, no, mummy. You say, you're a liar. And if there's one thing I hear worse than a thief, it's a liar. And you get some beatings in our homes, right? We still love them. Corporal punishment was around. It was madness and it was scarring us, just like everything else was. But what we didn't understand was, how comes you're going to beat me for bread and you're going to walk past and you're going to see police brutality. You're going to see the racists. You're going to see the National Front. You're going to see the skinheads. And you're going to put your head down. What's that about? What's that about? So we started to get pretty upset with our own parents. So we didn't want to be inside our homes with them. We started to be disrespectful about them because they weren't standing up and fighting. We got to a point where we started to say, you know what, they're irrelevant. They're irrelevant. They don't understand the system. They don't know. This is what they used to say. White people prejudice, man. And we used to say, prejudice. Yes, then prejudice. And we used to say, no. The word's racist. What that mean? They took it personally. They thought people just happened to be prejudiced against them. They didn't understand structural racism or how it worked or how it manifests itself. When we went to school, if something happened in school and we came home and we said, yo, mum, teacher, what you do? What did you do? They said, what do you mean what did we do? It's because I'm black, innit? Because I'm black, innit? I said, what you at, Tabo? What you do? And then they're going to try and beat you for you to confess what you did, because the teacher wouldn't just trouble you, because they couldn't conceive. They went to school. They were taught in the English manner. And if a teacher picked on them, it's because they were doing something wrong. They couldn't conceive that adult would treat children in that way in this country. They just couldn't conceive of it. So we got to a point where we just didn't want to be in these homes with them, because we couldn't really connect. But we had nowhere to go. We had nothing. So we kind of, I don't know how it happened, we kind of decided that we're going to go out on the streets and just hang out. Especially when unemployment and such came. Because when these high levels of unemployment came and you couldn't get a job, I still remember my dad, I would wake up in the morning, he said, boy, go look job, go look work. It's like, where? So you just had to come out the house, because if you was in the house, they'll be on you. And they'd want you to go and work in the factories where people would talk down to you and try. We wasn't having it. So we came out and we was on the streets. The problem with being on the streets is everybody else was out there. So that brought us into contention with teddy boys, rockers, skinheads, National Front, British movement, and their buddies, the good old British police. And the police, as we've said, from the 1960s, they were already out nigger bashing, but they were nigger bashing niggers, and I don't use that word normally. They were nigger bashing black people who weren't fighting back. Our generation were not going to have that. We were going to start fighting back. We started to fight the National Front. The National Front, oh man, they couldn't believe it. Give them some licks sometimes, because they just needed to understand we were not our parents. Why don't you fuck off back to where you come from? What? My parents, if they heard that, they would think, I wish I could, and they'll just carry on. Right? It was their dream. Some of my friends, they wish they could. They didn't want to be brought here. They didn't want their parents to be brought here. So they didn't too mind it. They didn't like being called all the N-word and the black bastard. But fuck off back home, they didn't mind. When I was told that, yo, I'm going to go mad now, because what the hell are you talking about? Which home? My parents came from some island over there, and it can't be that great, because if it was that great, they wouldn't be here taking your shit. This is my home. And if you don't believe me, be ready to fight to prove it. Because I'm here, and I'm going to stand my ground. And that's what we had to do. And when we started to do that, then the law turned on us. And the law turned on us by using the law. You've heard about the SOS laws? Yeah. A lot of people misunderstand the SOS laws, and they confuse it, and they talk and they compare it with stop and search. But the SOS laws predated stop and search. The SOS laws were not even a law. SOS laws were common law. They were something that they used to use Vagrancy Act. In the 15 and 16 and 1700s, they stopped using it until they saw black people turn up. The SOS laws meant that any two police officers could look at you and say, you're nicked. Suspicious person. She does look kind of suspicious, right? Even though she's got a lovely smile. The problem with it is if you go to court tomorrow morning, you can't say to a magistrate, I was just sitting there smiling when these police officers say, no, we saw her doing A, B, and C. They didn't need to bring a victim. They didn't need to bring a witness, just the words of two police officers. First time you got a fine, second time you went to detention center, third time you went to Borstal. Now, they didn't do ethnic monitoring, so we can't tell you the numbers that they put through that system. But believe me, tens of thousands of young black men, primarily and predominantly young black men. Some sisters did get nicked for SOS. But tens of thousands of young black men regularly on a daily basis was being arrested and locked up for SOS. First thing I ever got arrested for in my whole entire life was SOS. If I had the time to tell you the story, I'll tell you the story, because it was crazy. I'd gone to court to see someone who'd been arrested for SOS. And they arrested us in the court and then brought us back to the same court. And when we looked at the magistrates and said to the magistrate, we was in this court yesterday, we was over there. You kept on telling us to shut up. And the magistrate looked and said, there were 5 black boys in this court yesterday. but I can't tell if it was you. I can't tell one of you different from t'other. I can't tell one of you different from another. You dark is, he never said these words, but that's what he meant. You dark is all look the same. And when he said it, we knew we was in trouble. And he convicted us. And I saw my brother get sent to a detention centre, and they gave me a fine, 40 quid. That's a whole heap of money in those days. You know, I told you, I'm not paying that fine. We had an appeal. We went to the appeal. We took it seriously. We brought the original brother who had been nicked for sus. We brought his lawyer. His lawyer happened to be Asian. So the judge in the Crown Court, Knightsbridge Crown Court, he was really bored because these used to doing big cases. And here are we, these little impudent boys, appealing sus, as if British police officers would lie. And we got the lawyer to tell him we was in the court. He got up to talk, and the judge, who had been half asleep all the time, he suddenly heard the Asian voice, and he said to the prosecutor, he didn't even say talk to the Asian solicitor, barrister. He looked at the prosecutor and said, "This man is a barrister." And the prosecutor said, "Apparently so, my lord." And he said, "In an English court of law?" And the inference is his accent was so bad that the judge couldn't understand. Now, who in their right mind would go to any court with an Asian barrister who couldn't be understood? No one would do it. But the minute the judge did it, we knew exactly what happened. The judge said, "I see nothing wrong in these convictions. Take everybody back to prison." And I said, yo, judge, I ain't paying that." And he looked at me and said, "What? I beg your pardon?" I said, "I didn't do that shit. I'm not paying that fine." He said, "I increase your fine to £80. And I said, "Are you crazy?" And my mum and dad are out in the public gallery saying, "Boy, shut your mouth, shut up." And I'm like, no. I said I'm not paying £40, but he gave me £80 fine. The judge said, he looked at my feet, he said, "Young man, rest assured, if it wasn't for your record, you would be going to prison with your brother today." And then he told them to get me out of the dock. I'm one of the few kids that they've ever fought to get out of a dock. I just wanted to stay in the dock. I wanted to go to prison. I was not going to participate in what they did to me. So many of them went sent off to Borstalls, detention centres. And as a result, many of us started to stand up to resist the police. You may have heard, I know Darkers is on record when they go to court for the Mangrove cases. There's this great quote where Darkers House says, "We're fed up of complaining to the police about the police, and we're fed up of complaining to magistrates about magistrates." And that's what we decided, that we're getting fed up. There's no point appealing and complaining to police against police. There's no point in complaining to magistrates about magistrates. We just decided it's time to stand our ground and take them on. And let's remember, in 1966, when Roger Hunt wrote that book called Nigger Hunting, he said that the sergeants and the constables were doing it. So now we're in the 70s. The sergeants and the constables are now the inspectors and the chief inspectors and the superintendents. They don't necessarily have to come out and do the nigger hunting. They just use the law to get what they want. So we start standing up to them. So what we're spoken about is institutionalization. In sociology, institutionalization is the process of embedding some conception within an organization, social system, or society as a whole. The term may also be used to refer to committing a particular individual or group to an institution, such as mental or welfare institution. So this is institutionalization. We're being institutionalized, and they are institutionalizing their prejudice and their racism. We had things like the use of ESN schools. They are schools for educationally subnormal children. Imagine that, educationally subnormal, you know. These were kids who came from maybe the Caribbean, maybe Asia, maybe Africa, and didn't necessarily speak the Queen's English. We had busing. You know that? It's not just in America that they did busing. They did busing outside of London, and they did busing inside of London, and they did busing in Asian areas when schools, they said if you got more than 1/3 of the makeup of your schools were made up of ethnic minorities, they gave the local education authorities and the headmasters the right to be able to deny access to their schools to other people of colour. And thereby they had busings. They used the SOS laws, and they talked about the muggings. If you read Stuart Hall's book, you'll understand that was they whipped up hysteria, and they created the crisis that they then policed. That's not the only time they've done it. By the time when we get to the 4th lecture, if you can handle 4 lectures, by the time we get to the 4th lecture, we're going to show you that they did exactly the same thing in 2011. They whipped up the hysteria about the gangs. When they first spoke about gangs, they couldn't even name a gang. And then they brought in the kind of policies and procedures and practices that have created the gangs and led to the violence that we witness on the streets today. Favorite part, no. This is my favorite part, because this is when, after going to court, after being treated in the way we're being treated, after being kicked out of schools, after being abused by adults, you know, I got kicked off a bus and bus drivers calling me a little black bastard. Bus driver, you know. Milkman. See you looking at the milk float, think you're going to nick the milk. Get away from me, you little black bastard. Adults abusing behaviors that today, I mean, just wouldn't be acceptable, but in those days were just standard practice. So that's a result of the SOS, that's a result of the Keep Britain White campaigns and such, and that's a result of starting to tune into the countries that our parents come from, because all of a sudden now we're starting to hear some music and stuff coming out of Jamaica. And the music is telling us, stand up, get up, stand up. There's some Rasta man them down in Jamaica, and they're talking about Babylon. They're talking about the system. And we're starting to listen to that music. We're starting to listen to Bob. I know lots of people, you all know Bob, right? Yeah, 2 little birds, sit on my doorstep. We didn't listen to that crap. When we turn on, we didn't listen to that. We listened to war. Until the philosophy that says one race superior to another is permanently and finally abolished, there will always be war. That seemed reasonable to us. So the war had to happen, and it had to happen here. We're in the heart of Babylon. We decide, you know what? Let's just sacrifice ourselves in this place. Let's just go mad in this place. Let's just go ragamuffin. And ragamuffin meant ragamuffin and rough. Ragamuffin meant we're not our parents. Ragamuffin meant that we threw away everything, every way of dealing with the system that went before us. We dashed that away. Firebomb that. Ragamuffin and rough, and we're here to stay. What we first tried to do was become self-sufficient, because at the same time we're still being influenced by what happens in America. We've heard about the civil rights. We know what the Black Panthers were doing. We wanted to become self-sufficient and do for self and do for our community. So that's what we started to do. We used to hang out with each other. We didn't go to pubs, because if you went to pubs, that's generally where the racists were. And even if when they went in the pub, they weren't a racist, couple pies, and it all started to flow. So we didn't go to those places. We used to have our own party. We used to do our own things. We used to come together. I missed out bits about the Saturday, the supplementary schools and such. We started to become a community that tried to do for self. We used to have some beautiful parties. Wow. It was a house and days, a community. I'll just come out of my house, I'll see a black person, we talk. Anyone, it didn't matter who you were, see you down the road. We were community. We knew that we needed each other. We didn't know it was around the corner. These were the house and days of community, beautiful, amazing days. I'll go to parties, just walking down, someone say there's a party on the farm, and I'm like, there's 1,000-odd houses on the farm, and you don't know which block. Just listen for the music, hear the music, go to the door, fix up, knock on the door, can we come in? And I normally say, as long as you're all right, come in. Right? Listen to some beautiful reggae music and just chill. during one of those parties, you all know about it, happened down the road, New Cross. You know about the New Cross fire? Okay. Well, I'm really proud to say that some of the students here who are at the centre are actually studying and looking at what happened in the New Cross fire. There was a fire in New Cross, literally within walking distance from here. This fire, man. There was a party for two young girls, 16 and 18 years old, born in this country. They had a party together. It was a really good party, apparently. And because we're a community, people came from all over. We had people from Tottenham here, because one of them died in the fire. And this fire broke out. 13 dead and nothing said. The media dismissed the fire as a fire that happened in a party for West Indians. And the minute it was decided that it was West Indians in the party, nobody cared. Prime Minister didn't say nothing, Queen didn't say nothing, nobody cared. A couple of weeks later, there was a fire happening in Ireland, and I think a similar amount of people got killed, and the Prime Minister and the Queen sent their condolences. Us in New Cross, what happened was the police said, that fire was, that wasn't a firebomb. And there was a history in this area of firebombs. Youth clubs, hangout joints where people used to go and hang out, youth clubs and music venues were being firebombed. And when this firebomb happened, the police said, no, that was internal. What most people don't know is the police actually blamed the mother of the girls whose party was, said her ex-boyfriend was angry and jealous and came and set a fire. They didn't investigate. It was a racist attack, and people were clear about that. Witnesses saw that. 13 dead and nothing said, and they were children. This had such a, this is a seminal moment in our communities, up and down the country. It's what led to the Black People's Day of Action, when Darcus Howe and Gus John and Leela Howe were able to organise and bring 20,000 people to London and stop London. But it was also a seminal moment for the likes of myself in Tottenham, because we were there saying, well, if we can't even have a party, if we're going to have a party and people, the racists, can just come and firebomb us, the police are not going to investigate, and by not investigating, they're actually telling the racists, they're actively encouraging the racists. You can go and do this, we're not going to investigate, we won't catch you. Many of us in our communities were thinking, well, if this is going to be the way that they want us to live, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? We're going to turn ragamuffin and we're going to fight. I turned ragamuffin and fought to the point where I ended up in prison. I fought everybody who wasn't black. I couldn't understand the difference between the white power structure and white people. White racists were on the streets, the skinheads happened to be white, the National Front were white, the racist teacher were white, the bus driver who was racist was white. I just fought anybody. Look at me strange, look at me, and I ended up in prison. But this picture, it was taken off my wall and put in the exhibition, because what we wanted to show is even when we were ragamuffin, this was me drawing in picture, and I'm drawing Martin Luther King, not Malcolm X. I could have drawn Malcolm X. We believed in by any means necessary, but we was doing by any means necessary because we wanted our children to be born in a land where they were judged by the character and not by the color of their skin. So we fought, and sometimes we sacrificed ourselves. But also we started to come together in ways that our parents never did. Our parents, they came from these islands, so they weren't necessarily community. They came here and they became a community based on one thing, shared experience. But the islands they came from, they'd all been taught to dislike each other, just like in Africa, they've been taught to dislike each other, just like in Asia, they've been taught to dislike each other. So we were going to be different. We were starting to coalesce. We just found things that bound us together. Some of it was in the music, but it was also in this understanding that we were Africans. Our parents didn't want to hear that. They'd been tainted with the messages that the British and all others wanted to put about Africa. So we started to come together, and we found that in London we came together, Carnival 1976. Wow, that was my first carnival, 16 years old. Wow, that was the greatest carnival ever. Go and check out that one, because that carnival there, we beat police. That carnival there, police didn't have long truncheons and they didn't have shields. The carnival there was rumoured that the police officer kicked a young black woman who had a baby in her belly, and when we heard that, we said, all right, and we turned on them and we give them some licks. I mean, licks. You see some of those pictures, they're just the greatest pictures. Police officers with dust, I'm sorry, but this is payback. Police officers with dustbin lids because they haven't got no shield. And then in 1977, we said, we're coming back. And they said, we'll be ready for you. And we said, good. And they came out with new weaponry. They had long truncheons and long shields. And they put the police officers in churches and schools, and they showed them this film. And the film was First Blood. This was the Met hierarchy saying to the police officers before they sent them out, the darkies drew first blood last year. You lot go out there this year and you settle the score. And they came out in their numbers and we bust their ass again. All right? And I know I say it in a kind of flippant way, but I'm not being flippant. They learn, society learns, that when you oppress people to the point that they're ready to boil over and fight back, you're going to understand for you it's just a job, and for them who's fighting back it's a life. So what we started to learn is when we came together in numbers, we could stand up and we could resist these police. 1970s, it's Queen's Jubilee. When they said we was going to have the Queen's Jubilee, people were given a holiday, but we're all unemployed anyway, so what use was a holiday? But in Birmingham, they said, you know what, we're going to come together and we're going to celebrate African Liberation Day. And the conservatives went mad and the media went mad, and they said, you can't celebrate African Liberation Day on the Queen's Jubilee. And the Rastas said, what? Watch us. And we saw them come together. It was peaceful. It was beautiful. It was amazing to see them come together in these numbers, because this is the first time we're starting to see this in the country. We had a cricket team that came over. The cricket team was, wow, this was a time, right? When England had, right, when we was against apartheid, but England managed to have a cricket captain. Even before then, they said to us, Norman Tebbit, Margaret Thatcher's right-hand general, said, you darkies, you're not English. And we said, well, we don't call ourselves English, but we're born here. This is our country. And they said, no. For this to be your country, you need to be able to work back your family to 1066. And we said, what? And then we looked at our white friends and said, can you work back your family to 1066? And they said, no. Only Rees Moggs and those kind of people can work back their family to 1066. So they came with a different plan. They said, okay, this is the cricket test. We said, what? They said, yeah, who do you support when your country comes here to play cricket? And we weren't even into cricket. Silly game, took long. But when they said it made us a little bit interested, so we started to have a little interest. The West Indian cricket team was coming. They had this, and England had this white South African captain, and they said to the captain, the West Indian cricket team's coming. Have you got a message for them? And he said, yeah, in this broad South African accent, gonna make them grovel. And we said, what? Did he really say that? There's a film that the West Indian cricketers made. It's called, keep forgetting it, something in a Babylon, Fire in a Babylon, right? Thank you, Fire in a Babylon. And they said, yeah, when we got to England, those English black people, they were crazy. They were mad. They were just on us, telling us, you got to win. This is bigger than the game. The rab, you must win, you must win, you must win. And then we heard what Craig had said about making us grovel, so we decided we must win. And in that time, a new word was invented, and the word was blackwash. Blackwash. That's 5-0 to the West Indies. Oh, I can't tell you how that impacted us as young people. For the first time, even our older generation, we're seeing our pups and we're saying, yes, pups, because they love cricket. It brought us together as a community. It showed us that on a level playing field, we can compete and we can win. So when we went around and created these kind of numbers, level playing field, we was ready to take on anybody and everybody. And truth is, we did. So after the New Cross fire, although there were front lines in some areas, after the New Cross fire, when we found out that we were over-policed and under-protected, we came to a conclusion and a decision that, it's time we defend ourselves, because we can't rely on the system, we can't rely on the police. There were places in Brixton primarily. The original front line was in Brixton. That was about hustlers. That was about shebeens. It was about spaces and places that we came for relaxation and fun. But when we created front lines later on, especially those of us who were born in these countries, those front lines was about us delivering services. I came from the front line on Broadwater Farm. Broadwater Farm front line was different, and in lecture number 2, we're going to go into depth about Broadwater Farm. My man here, Nigel Norrie, he comes from Broadwater Farm. And we were different. We created a youth association. We were different because we dared to believe that the world was our oyster. We were different because we dared to believe that we could do for self and we didn't need nobody and nobody's help. We were different because we said, in these spaces and places, we don't want to see no racist faces. And on Broadwater Farm, we took over the estate. We started to do for our young people. And then we started to do for the estate itself. Then we eventually took over the estate and we turned it into a front line. That means we said to young people all over North London, from Tottenham, Edmonton, Wood Green, Hornsey, Stoke Newington, Stamford Hill, come chill with us. Come over here and chill with us, man. There's no racists here. There's no problems here. There were front lines. We put Brixton, the Black People's Day of Action, because in a sense that became a front line. There was a front line in organising. 20,000 black people came to London on a Monday. Not on a Saturday, on a Monday. They came to stop the city. And the police tried to stop them from going over Blackfriars Bridge, and we stopped the city. And that showed us that we had a power and an ability that if we came together, we could hold the state to account, or we could just burn the place down. But we were going to have it. We were not going to accept what our parents had. We were not going to accept it. And why should we? So we created front lines. There was front lines at All Saints Road. There was front lines in Brixton, front lines in Moss Side, Manchester, Handsworth, Birmingham, Toxteth, Liverpool, St Paul's, Bristol, and Broadwater Farm, London. And post the New Cross fire, the only time that there was a proper uprising before the New Cross fire was St Paul's. All the others happened after the New Cross fire. All the others happened in that year between 81 and the one that happened, the final one, Broadwater Farm, in 1985. The front lines were the spaces and places that we delivered services to our community. And the hustlers came. There was an economy. The economy was run by marijuana, weed. Yeah, right? Man needed to chill. People needed to chill. This was the economy. It was people sold and hustled, but it was pretty much a victimless crime. We were creating our own way of living. We were creating safe zones. No police on Broadwater Farm. If we saw police on Broadwater Farm tackling anybody, we just say, yo, boy, and we'll go to the police. And we'll take the police, take their hands off, take away the person, and tell the police, leave. And they left. They're bullies. Proper bullies. Use them, gang up. They're only hard when they come to you in numbers. There was nothing great in burning down our own neighbourhoods, but the problem is they wouldn't let us out to come to the city to attack the cities. So we fought wherever we could. We built on every single uprising. 81 and 83, the media talked about, looting and such on Broadwater Farm in 1985. Nowhere got looted. Broadwater Farm in 1985, a policeman lost his life. That was our way of trying to tell the state, anything you can do, we can do if we have to. I could go on for hours, but I've already overrun. And apparently, I've got to allow you all to ask me some questions. So I'm gonna bring it in there, yeah? Right? Thank you. Thank you. This is the history of our lived experience, and I hope that what I've given you means that those of you, because I know you're all bright, brilliant, great people, can go and research and build on the evidence base that we've produced here today. The floor is open for you to ask questions, but please don't ask anything too hard. Okay? Really? Yeah, sorry, someone's got a mic, sir.
Thank you so much for this lecture. I can't wait for the next ones already. I'm gonna count the days until then. But I want to come to something that you mentioned at the very beginning of your talk. And first, I'll say where I'm coming from when I want to ask, and it's about the word that you used, overthrow. You said nobody talked about an overthrow, right, or something along those lines, and so I'm coming from the point that I'm coming from. I'm Iranian, right, and so I'm coming from a context where there's an uprising happening in the context, and so I'm seeing, you're talking about police violence. I'm seeing police violence day and night as I wake up, and I live with that, right, and so. And so I'm thinking, why not? You're talking about organizing, you're talking about front lines, you're talking about building a community, coming out of a home, because home is not a safe space. But where do you organize, and how do you organize, and how do you take down the you're talking about this, but why? What is? How do you position yourself in relation to an overthrow? What does that mean? And why not?
When you're in a country that is your own, then you might think about overthrowing, because you're not going anywhere. You can remove those in power, or want to remove those in power, or want to change the power and change the power dynamics. We were in a country that wasn't even our own, even though some of us are born here. So for us, it's not about overthrowing, it was about changing and impacting the system, trying to fight the system to such a point that the system was ready to engage with us to make a difference. I don't think we were as organised in our struggle here in England as maybe my comrades were in places that I refer to like Derry, the Bogside, north of Ireland, We saw there with the IRA that the government told us they were terrorists. The government told us we shouldn't even be able to listen to what they had to say, but we saw them fight and resist and make sacrifices until the point that although they didn't overthrow, the government was willing to negotiate with them. I think in each different country, our struggles are going to be somewhat different, but that we have to be prepared to stand up and make sacrifices. I was on a call yesterday, a Twitter call about policing, and they said, well, what's the solution? What's the solution? And the young people said, we're going to tell them we withdraw our consent. We withdraw consent for policing. And I was like, what? What are you talking about? To withdraw consent for policing? What does that even mean? If you want to make a difference, if you want to make a change, you have to stand up and fight. And you have to be willing to make sacrifices and sometimes be sacrificed to make that change in the long run. Does that help? Go any way to answer your question? But I can see in Iran lots of people are making sacrifices right now, and I think that the rest of the world outwardly are ready and willing to support them as best we can. But you don't get to overthrow oppressive states without being ready to make those sacrifices. Yeah.
I think also there's just the fact that if we, from my perspective, I always think of things as like we're 3 generations in. So as my dad said, his mum's generation came here with the expectation of going back home. And so even when they were facing racism, and even knowing that they were here and had their children here, the plan was still to go home. You know, that's why they accepted certain things, because in their minds, they don't belong to this place. My dad, as a first generation Black Brit, his intention was, I'm here, I don't have a home back there, this is my home, I'm gonna make it my home, you guys are gonna know it's my home. So that's what he's fighting for. Our generation now, I can tell you what we're fighting for if we're fighting at all. Or as we're learning to fight and we start to assemble the pieces of the small puzzle that we've got in, like, our puzzle is small and it's still really complicated to kind of understand what we should be fighting for, or how we should be fighting, who exactly we're fighting against, because there's the police and then there's the government and then there's just there's different layers to it and different attacks at different times for different reasons. It's still very new for us, and yeah, are we going to fight to overthrow a government in this country? Here? Personally, no. Here? No. They're just about getting rid of head of states back home. Like, there's so much happening here and back home still, and it's along different timelines. Like, there is, I don't know about overthrowing.
So not always about overthrow, it's about challenge. But sometimes it's also about change, and it's about trying to fight for change. And again, on this call yesterday, some people said, I said something about standing up and taking them on, and people said, oh, well, that's what happened in 2011, and look what happened, everyone got arrested and locked up. And then 10 minutes later, they spoke about Chris Kaba, and they spoke about the family of Chris Kaba seeing the footage of him being murdered. And then we had to point out that the only reason that police officers today have cameras on their bodies is because they murdered Mark Duggan, and we went mad in Tottenham, and we kicked off a little bit, and we campaigned and we demanded the police officers had cameras. Sometimes the struggle and the victories and the benefits are incremental, and you don't always see them in real time, but that shouldn't mean that we don't struggle. If we don't struggle, then we have to live with the dissonance that creates inside of us, and that dissonance ultimately leads to sickness and illness and madness, as far as I'm concerned. So as far as I'm concerned, we have to struggle, regardless the cost and regardless the outcome, even if our outcome is ultimately overthrowing. Our outcome for everyone is the same. We just want some liberty and freedom and the right to live as human beings, right? And we have to fight for that. Sister.
Thank you very much. This has been amazing. You spoke about that kind of intergenerational disconnect, so between like yourself and the generation before. So that would be like my grandmother who came around the same time as your mum, and then my mum, and then obviously myself. So how do we kind of piece that together? Because I still see it very much a thing now. But you guys, especially your generation, you fought back and you kind of set this foundation and blueprint. And I think much of that is, I don't want to say it's lost because it's here, but it just feels very hard to kind of access and piece together and kind of put together as a picture to say, okay, here's the foundation, here's the blueprint, and we can kind of take that forward. So I wanted to know if you have any, I guess, words of wisdom in terms of how we can connect to, you know, from our generation to our parents and to their parents, to just try and, I guess, have that sense of understanding, but also that journey and what we can then take moving forward, because the fight obviously still continues. It's not over.
Okay. So she's that generation, right?
I'm that generation, and
Right, let me just say, sorry.
ultimately you have to listen.
Right. No, because you know what? Because when I told you when we went ragamuffin, I'm going to give it back to her. Right. When we went ragamuffin, right, we threw the baby out with the bathwater. All right, we're like, yo, if all our friends are being sent to ESN schools, fuck school. Our parents are telling us go to supplementary school. It's like, when we go to supplementary school, is that going to give us qualifications to be able to go and get jobs in their system? Then no. So we chucked away everything, even recording and writing of what we did. We did have people like Menelik Shabazz, right, who were documenting things that were happening. But in the main, we were so ragamuffin. We had no wish. We didn't even stop to capture and explain. And sometimes we were so ragamuffin that young people got caught up in things they didn't even understand what they were caught up in. It was emotional reactions and responses. Our stories, I mean, we saw last year Steve McQueen's trying to tell a few of our stories. The problem is we don't even have the spaces and places that we can come together to tell our stories anymore. We come from Broadwater Farm. We had a youth association on Broadwater Farm. We had a space where we could educate, where we could bring people in. We did courses. We did all kinds of activities. The system ensured that they broke us down and ensured that our stories couldn't be told. When we go on to tell future stories, we'll tell about how they sent in the hard drugs and the impact on the hard drugs on our community was absolutely devastating. And that fractured and broke us down as a community. The elder generation that has captured much of this, and I've got to say this, right, because in preparing for this, we went to the archives. There are black archives in this country. Unfortunately, they're not always in the control of black people. They're in the control of people who, I mean, look, we just had Black History Month, right? We just had Black History Month. We got what? Should I name the archives? I don't need to name the archives. We got BCA. We got IRR. Come on, help me. Padmore. Why aren't they here? Why aren't during Black History Month all the archives coming together to share what they have? Because they all have pieces of our story to share what they have with us and our community, because that's what you need to do to build that sense of respect, understanding, identity, and resilience. And unfortunately, they keep it back. And then we have What we didn't have then in those days is cadres of young people who are going to universities, who have opportunities to do some learning, but the universities only expect and accept and put them to look at a fragment, a part of our experience, not the entirety of our experience, because again, it's not even in their interest for us to know our story and to know ourselves. But ultimately, we got to take responsibility. We can't expect our enemy, our oppressors, or those who didn't like us, support us, or invest in us to do that on our behalf.
I do follow that. I listen to what he says, I take it, and I have to live my life. Not just as he says, but I think at the root of everything, it's like action. What can you do? Forget about everyone else at some point, because you are responsible for what is in your control, and that alone, as long as you're contributing something, you just keep pushing forward with that. If you've been taught that this is a certain way that works for community and for your wider community, you do that, right? Trust that at some point it falls into place. I was my dad's apprentice when I was 16, 17 years old, and then I went to university. And when I went to university, oh my God, everything was very much like, don't go there and learn their language and just come back and tell me what is this and that and that and that and that. I actually had to take that on board and say, actually, I'm going to get a certain type of education and it can open me up to certain things, but I'm also from a certain place and there's work to be done here. And if I want to do that work, and I want to be able to relate to my dad, I have to make that effort. It's hard, but you have to be willing to do that. If you want to have that intergenerational bond, you're going to have to bend. And sometimes it's not easy because you think it's all about maybe their legacy or just preserving their ideas and conceptualization of the world, and that maybe they don't listen to you and they don't understand what you're going through sometimes. But there's a reason why they struggled so hard, and it is so that you can have certain types of privileges, make sure you're using it and making it relational, and that's how you keep it mutual. And at some point, it benefits them. And we come together and we make things like this, but we have to be willing to take time. Firstly, you have time. Listen, this stuff is not getting better. Like, I don't want to say that. It's not getting better overnight, and it's not getting better just because we want it to and we're making an effort to. It's getting better because certain things happen at certain times, and they're small things though. So overall, take your time and work with what you've got and who you've got. Ultimately, the intergenerational relationship is the gem. So if you can focus on maintaining that, then you've got more than anything else, right? I love you.
Thank you, guys. You touched on it a little bit earlier about we're probably going to have another winter of discontent. The way things are going economically, socially, etc., all of the ologies. Are there any tips that you have for our generation, building on the sister's question, so we don't reinvent the failures of the past?
You know, again, you know, for me, the best way to survive is by coming together with others, right? And also recognizing that in this winter content, when times are hard for you, then times must be harder for a whole heap of other people outside there. Because that's the notion of community, is about how we start to care for self and do for self. And that was one of the things that drove us back in this time. We were still influenced by the Black Panthers and such in America. I grew up with my mother telling me the words of Marcus Garvey. who know better must do better. My mum used to tell me, if you see someone going along the way and they fall by the side, you must help them and pick them up and help them along the way. And I think what I would say to young people in our community today is, look around yourself. Don't just look inside yourself. Understand our struggle here in this country. Don't just be doing this social media stuff and looking what's going on in the States. It's about understanding that what is happening is bigger than all of us, and finding out how we can engage and link with others to support them as well as seeking support. And sometimes we grow when we give that support to others. We're in a unique situation. Was it the Robbins report? Which was a report that after the uprising started to say that universities needed to open up, needed to become more diverse. So we're in this unique situation now where we've got so many of our young people who have gone to universities and such. We didn't have that in our time. How can you come and plug that back in to the community? Because sometimes in helping others to grow, you actually grow yourself. That's how I grew. When I came out of prison, I wanted to be a youth worker. I went and worked with young people. I didn't know much, but I knew more than them. So I was able to help them. And in helping them, I started to grow. If we're going to get through this, it's going to have to be as a community. Because otherwise, you see all them mad Tory people there. You hear the kind of things that they're saying. You know who they're coming up. We know who's going to pay the cost for everyone. So for me, it's about people coming together, not thinking about self, but thinking about community and thinking about how can I help those who are in a lesser situation and position than myself. I think when we do that, we just become stronger because we're no longer just individuals, we're community.
I think that was the answer. But also, right? You already know, Wayland. But you can't be scared to go through a bad time, right? It's going to happen anyway. You have to survive it. We need you. We need everyone here. You have to make it through. I don't know. I couldn't tell you based on the resources that you have, because I don't know them specifically, but you have something available to you. And as he said, when you reach out to people and say, how are you? What's going on with you? Like, what do you have? We can put out every mickle. That's it, right? You have to put in something to get something sometimes. Show someone else what you've got and they'll show you as well and you'll find it. It's there, like. If not, we're here. Sometimes.
Thank you so much for your presentation, both of you. I guess it kind of follows on from the last question, and I guess I'm thinking some beyond the winter of discontent, through your collaboration with like Forensic Architecture and the Centre for Research Architecture, from this position you are now, what do you imagine to be like an outcome from these workshops, from this sort of constructive like dialogues, what you might make along the way? Do you have, if there were, one or two outcomes, outputs, what do you imagine them to be right now?
Wow. When we went to the ICA, wow. Do you remember when Eyal first said to me, he said he had the connection to the ICA because we know that Forensic Architecture been nominated for loads of prestigious awards, and he said, "Can we go in there and can we get you to talk about the campaigns that you have done previously?" I said, "Yeah, of course." When we went there, we didn't know we was going to put on a record-breaking event at all. We didn't even know if we could get black people to come to that place there, because that place was truly Babylon, right? Truly Babylon. And in being able to get 11,000 people to come there, to see in the eyes, we had young people. I had young people come there, and they come up to me and say, a young woman said to me, "You know what, Staff?" She was with Forefront. She said, "You know what, Staff? Me and my dad, we don't even get on. But now I've seen this exhibition, I understand my dad better, and I'm going to come with my dad." And she came with her dad. We had people come there that we couldn't have imagined, we couldn't have expected. So already that surpassed all expectations. But then again, the professor did it again, and here we are, in front of all of you good people. And if 1/5 of the audience here today has learned something, sees things a little bit differently, then we've achieved more than we could really ever set out. But even more than that, whilst we're here today, we're also launching a offshoot of War in Babylon. It's called Open Wounds. And we're in the King's Fund. Wow, if you not know the history of the King's Fund. If the ICA was Babylon, then the King's Fund, guys, really the King's Fund, right? And the King's Fund, they're a health think tank. And when the King's Fund talks, the National Health Service and the social care system, they all sit up and listen. And the King's Fund has said, "Wow, we saw what you did in War in Babylon. Do you want to do the same thing where you're talking to the NHS about discrimination in the healthcare service?" And we said, absolutely. So we have that exhibition there right now. And unlike the police, we put up this exhibition. We said to the NHS, "Come and see what we're saying." And the NHS have turned up and they've said to us, "Staff, can we come and meet with you? And can we talk and work and see how we can work on this to improve access to services, to improve jobs?" So we haven't got a specific intention other than to impact people. And everything we do, everything I do as an activist has always been about having some impact. And if we can impact a room full of people, the seeds would have been sown and they will flourish at some point in some time, somewhere along the line. If we can talk to a room full of people, especially our young black people, and give them resilience and hope and courage. But hope, more than anything, is really important, because many of our young people have never seen a victory and don't know what a victory looks like. If we can put on presentations like this and inspire, the man over there, Emmanuel, if we can he's going to speak in a moment. If we can inspire and support, because Emmanuel comes from our network. Wait, don't bother going like you're shy, Emmanuel. Right? If we can inspire and support just one individual to follow in the footsteps, follow in the pathways that we've created previously, then I think we've achieved. But mainly, it's just about sharing information, empowering people, and giving people the courage and the temerity to say, "Yo, I want to be more resilient and more able to stand up and talk about the things that I believe in." And if we can come into this space and get just one of you to say, "You know what, when I go and write, I'm going to write what I believe and not what they want to hear," then I think we're doing amazingly well. And just the relationships that we've created, I think, again, is a blueprint for our community going forward, to understand that we know we're marginalized, we know we're isolated, and the ways to overcome marginalization and isolation isn't to turn inwards and just talk to self, but it's to turn outwards and talk and try and engage and try and invoke a sense of responsibility in people, in our communities, and in the audiences that we talk to. So long you forgot the question, right?
A little bit. Interestingly, that was like the macro of it. I would say on a micro level, really practical skills. There's people in here who might be able to do like admin or something like that. My dad has worked alone since the 1980s, since he was younger than I am now, right? So when I look at my dad and I see him doing this work, we have had an opportunity to come together, and it has made this amazing thing, right? And that has come out of just me, my dad, one of my close friends, and one of her close friends, Eyal, of course, and forensic architecture. That it's such a small amount of people that have brought together such an amazing, impactful piece of work, right? There's far more of us in here right now than there is that actually contributed to this happening. So if anyone in here has like tangible skills, lend it to the people who are speaking about the issues, right? You should, after leaving here, it's not just that you leave inspired and you want to tell someone else about it, you kind of pay it forward in that way. Go directly to the source and say, what can I do for you, literally, that could help you? What can ease your day? What could, you know, if there's admin that you need doing, or you need some kind of marketing, right? So then you don't have to promote your own events and whatnot. What can I contribute? Like, just think about the small things that you can do. That is what is actually need. That's what's really, really needed. And again, if everyone contributed a tiny thing, then it's done. If everyone who showed up at events, if everyone who showed up at the BLM protest, at the first protest that happens, right? Something is done. You will feel better for it. You will then know how to kind of expand upon it, and things can grow and become, I guess, functional community groups where you see not only that you have a shared experience or a shared pain or a trauma or whatever, you have a purpose. So yeah, that what I imagine is that people start to become useful.
Okay, so before we end, can we remind everyone that on tomorrow, first of all, tomorrow we're actually here again, 2 o'clock till 5. They're going to work us. 2 o'clock until whenever it's over, doing a practical workshop around campaigning. And really importantly, on Saturday, the UFFC, that's the United Friends and Families, they hold their annual march. It's a march that commemorates the death in custody of their loved ones. It's the strangest, we talked about it at the exhibition, it's the strangest time, because there's an organization of their families, their victims, they've lost their loved ones, they've created an organization that they didn't want to create because it's a space for those who've lost their loved ones to come together. The only way that this organization can be sustained is if the state keeps on killing people. And they know this. But they also know that the state does keep on killing people. So the last Saturday in every month, they come together, they march from the last Saturday in October, they march from Trafalgar Square to outside Downing Street and make some noise. This year it's expected to be bigger, because obviously we had the police killing of Chris Kaba and Alada Jene, who jumped off of the bridge. So we expect more people to be there. It'd be great if people could come and support that event and support those families and let those families know that they're not alone. So I guess, is it me to close? Can I say the last words? I'm going to say, because Black History Month is soon over. So I'm going to end this with my favorite quote that I've ever heard on Black. Oh, sorry, man. You're sorry, bro. Sorry, man. I wasn't doing that on purpose.
Educational subnormal schools and stuff like that. There was like a thought of like eugenics that was rooted in like that process of like education for like young people. How do you think like the school of eugenics, the school of thought eugenics, still operates today in like society and just the way we like living today? And
He just put that one straight on my back, you know that? That was a really, really good question, thank you. I told you that we're just doing another exhibition at the King's Fund. It's called Open Wounds, right? Now, this is in 2019, 2020, during the pandemic and the lockdown. Didn't you all see the burning question of eugenics? Didn't you see the rise of eugenics? Did you see it? Did you? You sure? Because the eugenic question came about when they started to say, first of all, they said, COVID's coming, but don't worry. Boris said, don't worry, we've got this covered. Everyone can go to work, keep shaking hands. Then they said, herd immunity. But then they said, the virus doesn't discriminate. We're all in this together. And then they said, let's clap for the angels. Do you remember clapping for the angels? The angels. Do you remember? Some of you didn't clap, right? I couldn't clap because the angels didn't look like me. And the angels didn't look like who I see when I go to hospital. The angels happened to be the white nurses. And people were coming out at 8 o'clock to clap for them. And they were the ones that we were seeing. And then all of a sudden we heard black and brown people are more likely to catch COVID and more likely to die from it. You remember? And there was an outcry, because now we understand we're not all in this all together. And it appears that the virus does discriminate. So we started to demand to know why it was that we were more likely to catch it and more likely to die from it. And the government called for the the PHE, Public Health England COVID-19 review. Do you remember? Do you remember? Now listen to this, because this is what happened, right? I'm sorry I'm taking up a little time, because this is what happened. The government called for the review in March 2020, I think it was, right? And what happened a couple weeks later, before the review came out in July? George Floyd got murdered. Listen to this, because this happened right in front of everyone's face. This is Babylon. George Floyd got murdered. Black Lives Matter happened. Black kids came out in their tens of thousands, even though we knew we were more likely to catch COVID and more likely to die from it. People felt that they had to come out because we was dying anyway. And some people destroyed some statues. When the government saw those statues being destroyed, Boris and his boys, those ones who can reach back to 1066, Boris and Rees Moggs, they decided that they wasn't going to have that. So they set up the CRED that you spoke about, the Commission for Racial and Ethnic Disparity. They set that up. Right? George Floyd was killed exactly 1 week before the release of the COVID-19 review. And because they set up the CRED, the Commission for Race and Ethnicity Disparity, and because they knew they was going to put Tony Sellout Sewell to run it, and they knew that his job was, his black face was to come back and deny institutional racism. When the PHE review was going to be released, days later, they tore out everything in the review that had anything to do with structural racism. Do you all remember? The review got released. They didn't answer any questions. The review was supposed to tell us why we're more likely to catch it, why we're more likely to die from it, and how we could be protected. In not telling us the social, economic drivers, the environment that meant we were more likely to catch it, the fact that we had to go to these poor jobs, the fact that we lived in overcrowded households, the social economic drivers, when they pulled all of that away, what they left was the question, what is it about black and brown people that make them more susceptible? That's eugenics, right? Because straight away, they're acting as if there was a biological answer and not a structural answer. And we saw it. I took a photograph days later of me on the train. It was supposed to be, I knew it was supposed to be, what's that thing when we don't sit next to each other? Social distancing. But I had the whole entire platform. I had the whole entire row of seats on this tube. And I could take a photograph that I sent to my family of 5 white people all standing up there next to each other, holding onto the thing. They got their masks, but they're all next to each other, and they're not sitting next to me because the government was leaving this question in the air, what is it about people like him that make them more likely to catch and die? And you saw the woman at the train station when the man said, keep away, and he spat on her. Yeah. And then she caught COVID. We don't know if she caught it from that, but she caught COVID and she died. This was because the government wanted to come out. They knew this report wasn't going to come out for 1 year, but they were willing to sell us out, to make out that somehow we had biological differences. And that's why we could catch COVID. That's the eugenics argument. It never goes away. And that's why we're at the King's Fund saying to the NHS that when the government did this, you knew and you went silent. Your complicity cost lives. And your complicity as the medical profession, what it did to our community was remind us and people who have their are always in self-preservation mode, it reminded us of the arguments of eugenics. And that's why many people then started to have the total distrust in the vaccines that were later on created. And even when they created the vaccines, what did they say? We should test them out down in Africa, right? On African kids. And that's what made our communities turn their back on the system in great numbers. So the King's Fund, we're telling them, don't think that what you saw was black people showing vaccine hesitancy. What you saw was black people showing a total distrust in the healthcare system. And black people remembering and linking to the history of years gone by. And we all saw that in full and plain public view.
You done it.
Apparently, I don't know what else. Thank you. Oh, now I can do my favorite quote, right? Favorite Black History Month quote. It came from Bernie Grant on the 7th of October when he said to the British media, "The youth say that the police came here to do them harm and they defended themselves and they shouldn't be punished because they gave the police a bloody good hiding." What a quote! What a quote! That's ragamuffin. That's ragamuffin. That's ragamuffin. Thank you all. Thank you all.